Hello, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here this morning. Welcome to the launch of Coffee and Containers. We really want this to evolve into a monthly gathering for us all to interact, discuss various aspects of platform engineering, things like infrastructure as code, containers, Kubernetes, and more. We really want this community to help us drive the things that we talk about. And the goal really is to build that tight community of professionals that are motivated to collaborate, motivated to share ideas and best practices with each other, and really to all of us to learn from each other. We are recording this session, and we're going to be sending a link out to everyone here who is registered for the event by tomorrow. So if you'd like to watch any of this later, and then at some point we're going to be building a channel as well so that you'll be able to watch not only this, but any of the other recordings that we put up there and archive. I am Jim Schultz. I'm the founder and president of North American DevOps Group, and I'm also a developer advocate at Shipa. I'm going to be moderating our discussion today. This month, we're going to be speaking with Kelsey Hightower. Kelsey's a thought leader in the platform engineering space, and he's also a staff developer advocate at Google Cloud Platform. We're going to talk to him about the state of Kubernetes, the challenges associated with that, and then we're also going to talk to Bruno Andrade, who is the founder of Shipa, and he's here to share how Shipa can address some of these challenges that we discuss, for which Kelsey is then prepared to provide some real-time feedback on what Bruno talks about. So before we kick things off here, give Kelsey and Bruno an opportunity to do a quick intro themselves. So Kelsey, hello there. I don't see coffee in your hand.
Hey, no coffee. You don't want to see Kelsey with coffee. Enough with water. Hey, Kelsey, longtime community member of Kubernetes, and kind of looking forward to the discussion today.
Cool. Thank you, Kelsey, for being here. And Bruno, if you'd like to say a quick hello.
Yeah. So thanks for the opportunity. Being into the cloud native space for some time, decided to get together with a few folks to found Shipa to try and solve the application challenges. So yeah, that's me. And I like the guitar. Memories of when I used to have a life. So yeah, that's one of my passions, I would say.
So maybe for one of these recordings we do, you can actually play some music for us to kick things off.
We can definitely think about it. I tell my wife that the success of apps on Kubernetes heavily depends on me having more guitars. I'm trying to get her buy-in to that. So we'll get there. Yeah.
Good luck with that. All right, cool. Well, thank you both for being here today and helping us launch this community. Before we jump into the talk, what we'd really like to do, again, we want this to be a community-driven event, right? And we want the topics to be driven by the attendees in the community. So the way we're going to do that today is I've got a poll set up that just lists some of the challenges around Kubernetes. And let me go ahead and share that poll. So for everyone attending, oh, we've already got the poll launched. Cool. We got lots of response on the poll rate. Sorry, I must have launched that and then forgot to unlaunch it. So let me give about another 10 seconds here on the poll. Then we'll share the results. And what we want to do is use the results of the poll to help drive our conversation here. All right, we got really great responses from everybody. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the poll. Let's take a look at the results here. So those are the question of the poll was what is most challenging in Kubernetes? And the top response here, 47%, the learning curve and management of object-centric application architecture. So going from standard legacy type of applications and moving into object-centric. I think a lot of people have a lot of trouble making sense of that, right? And managing that, especially as they scale. And so, Kelsey, maybe we can start with you. Do you have any comments on that? Are you kind of seeing the same thing in terms of is that the biggest challenge that you run across when people are trying to make this transition?
Yeah, so I think this also speaks to another thing, that learning is hard in general, right? So everything is, I think, in terms of new things. Like when I learned Linux for the first time, I think I'm still about 15, 16 years in, still learning Linux, the system calls, the shell, the various utilities, and how to piece things together. So I don't think you're ever going to stop learning. I don't think it'll be easy. But specifically the question here, which is, managing all these objects, right? So what does that mean? I think a lot of times we come from, at least me personally, we come from a world where you automate things you understand, or you use like scripting languages that let you do pretty much anything. If this, do that. And then you can kind of navigate through there. In the Kubernetes world, though, it's a bit more disciplined, right? It's like when I went from bash scripting to maybe Python, these days it would be Golang. When you get into like a statically typed language, it's going to force you to do a little bit more upfront. You need to be a little bit more clear about what you're doing. So when I look at Kubernetes, it's more like a typed, it's almost like a statically typed infrastructure tool, which is very different from what most people are used to. Even though we say infrastructure is code, most people are thinking about kind of these scripting things, right? But in Kubernetes, you have to learn what a pod is. You have to learn what a service is and how they interrelate with each other. And that proposes a little bit of challenge that you have to learn these types before you can do anything. But the nice thing about that, though, is once you learn these types, or in order to do anything in Kubernetes, you have to declare a new type, like create a CRD, custom resource definition. And then you have to do the implementation. So a lot of people see that as a hurdle. It's like, oh, all I want to do is just deploy this app. Give me something that says, deploy this app. But underneath Kubernetes, in order to have those higher level tools, you start to appreciate the statically typed nature of how it expresses infrastructure. So yeah, it's going to be a learning curve because Kubernetes will force you to learn its type structure before you can do anything, but that's only at the base level. And I'm hoping today we can dig into how tools like Shipa, that rightfully so, sit above that statically typed language of Kubernetes to provide these kind of workflows, the things that people say should be much easier. I believe tools above it should be doing that work.
Yep. Bruno, what are your thoughts there? Anything you have something to show us in regards to how you would address this?
That's right, and I agree with what Kelsey mentioned. I think it's important for you to understand what is happening and how the objects are interacting and how this relates to your application itself. And when we started thinking about it on building it with Shipa, for example, we interviewed a lot of users and we realized that was a big issue for them. And a lot of them, they were even asking us and say, what is an application, right, on Kubernetes? Because after I deploy my objects, basically they become these living objects in the cluster and they have no relation. So when we started addressing that with Shipa, we built, I think one of the keywords that Kelsey mentioned is the workflow, right? So how do you build the development workflow or into your application framework in a way that when applications are deployed, you see that even though Shipa is automatically creating these objects, populating and giving you the relationship like you see in the map and the application dependency here, gives you a very nice view of what objects are related to my app, what's the status, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, and it gives you the status. At the same time, it gives you visibility into if you need to troubleshoot something, you still have visibility and you can tap into that at any moment. So we started creating that as part of the workflow for the app. We allow the users to deploy without having to create these objects manually, but at the same time, we give you the visibility. And I think the question goes back to Kelsey. So what do you think in terms of the workflow and creating that automatically, but giving users I would say the relationship and the visibility into that, Kelsey?
All right, so let's make sure that everyone, different people are probably newer to Kubernetes. Some people have a lot more experience. So, you look at Kubernetes and say, why is Kubernetes not more like Shipa or some of the tools you kind of see in the space? And again, we need that assembly language. We need this neutral layer so that these tools can interoperate with each other. So what most people were thinking in the Kubernetes world, especially if you have experience with Docker, you were thinking, Docker build, Docker run, and then your app should be up, right? And like everyone's like, that's how it should work. But the truth is, you're going to need more than that on day 2 and day 3, right? You're going to have things like secrets. You're going to have things like config maps. You're going to have all this other stuff that you're going to need beyond that 5 minutes to happiness. So I think, I'm going to be critiquing this platform. Yeah. I see here that you have this concept of applications. So when I look at this, I'm saying, look, one thing you could do here is you can let me paste this big Kubernetes YAML block and call it an app. That's one way you can go about this. So I'm kind of interested here. If you were to click on like application, or if I'm a developer, show me in the Shipa world, like how am I describing to you an application, and tell me a little bit why this is probably better than writing a bunch of YAML files.
Awesome. I think that's a good question. So We take the approach of connecting the platform engineering team and the development team. So I'll cover it from a development perspective. Let's say after the platform engineering team came in, they defined the guardrails and the security around the deployments and the clusters. Now I come in as a developer. Someone gave me the access. If I'm building my application, for example, one simple example is I have a Ruby app here. And I'm a developer. I don't know Kubernetes, or I have very high level of Kubernetes, but I'm not accessing or creating the clusters or creating the objects. What I have in front of me is basically my Ruby code, where I have my gem files, where I explicitly say what I need in terms of packages. And I can declare any type of operating system packages that I need as well as Ruby. So let's say now I have my app in here. I can just say Shipa app create if I'm not using my CI pipeline, just for the
So
sake
hold
of
on
it.
for a second for me. So let me see that source code directory, right? So I've written code in the past. And if I look at this directory, okay, I've written Ruby before. I see my proc file. These are all the things I would use for just maybe local development, having a way to start the process, maybe change my code and see it reflected automatically. But then I'm curious over here. I'm like, hey, where's the Docker file? Right? When we start talking Kubernetes, we start talking Docker files real quick. Where's the Docker file here?
So good question. So there are two options. If you're deploying directly from source, in that case, you don't need to build a Docker file. So you have two options with Shipa today. You can build Shipa, if you deploy directly from source, Shipa will build the image for you, and then we'll create all the related objects as part of the deployment process and deploy it to the cluster. Now, reality is most of the users, they already have their images built, and they are basically hosted on Artifactory or Docker Hub or somewhere. In that case, if you already have, you're going to run a Shipa deploy, for example, the name of the app, or Ruby in this case, and then you're going to say basically like this. So you're going to point Shipa to your registry. Shipa will pull that image, and then we'll create anyways all the other related objects that you need in the cluster for your application to work, populate the dependencies and everything else. So you have those two options.
So what I'm seeing here is like, so I visit hundreds of companies all over the world.
Yeah.
I've been in the product space in my days at CoreOS. I worked at Puppet Labs. And throughout my entire career, even, when I think about my job in the enterprise, building this stuff from scratch, everyone has been trying to build like App Engine or Heroku from the ground up, right? Everyone's building their own platform. And what I'm looking at here, it seems like you're saying, look, we have a platform that sits on top of Cube, and it looks like there's a big imperative opinionated flow here, like Shipa app deploy this thing from this repository.
You're correct. So while we try to bring the experience from a user perspective, I think there is a big topic there in terms of the platform as a service, right? And like Heroku that you mentioned and the others. And these guys, the way we see them, they impose very, very opinionated, even when it comes down to the infrastructure. And that's a big challenge with organizations, especially when you talk about enterprises, that they want to have the flexibility of choosing, I'm going to run this on GKE version 1.15, or this one on 1.17, or I'm going to run on premises Kubernetes, and this is the edge. So you start getting into those, and we call Shipa an application framework because we don't impose any of that, but we rather let you choose that. But when it comes to the developer experience, then we allow you to have that similar developer experience that you can easily deploy and operate your apps. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so let me look at that shipa.yaml file right there. Like I see this little shipa.yaml. I'm wondering what's in it.
And in this, is it okay? Can you read this, or too small?
Yeah, make it a little bit bigger. So I see that you got some hooks here, and it's like, hey, it looks like there's a build command.
So on the Shipa YAML, it's actually optional. The developer, they don't need to add that. Let me even open this here, learn.shipa.io. The Shipa YAML file is an optional file. This may be too small, but.
Oh, look, you have documentation. Okay, you're off to a good start. I like to see those kind of things.
And he matches the color of the logo. See, that's even another level. But from a Shipa YAML file, you can basically define hooks that you can run when your application is, or when your image is being built, after it's being built, or before your application is restarted. And another option that you have is running a health check. So as a developer, you can put a health check and say, hey, run a health check on this path, try to do a get, and I need a 200. If there's no 200, basically it rolls back the deployment without affecting the previous version that is in there. So those are the two options that you have there. But again, those are optional for the developer.
So this kind of gets to the point. I always, when I talk to customers and they say, the problem I think I see a lot of people do in this kind of Kubernetes space is they go and start teaching all the developers all the Kubernetes objects. And in some cases, that may make sense if you have a developer who really wants to deal with that layer. But I always caution customers to think about what is the company.yaml, right? What is the smallest subset of data that you need from your developer team to make something happen on top of Kube, maybe to the point where they don't even know that Kubernetes is there, right? You have your own contract with your org, and it looks like you're kind of putting together like your own contract saying, these are the two things from now. I'm pretty sure the project is pretty early in terms of maybe there'll be more optional things that should go in there, but health checks, how to build in my package, my thing. And then is a contract that I'm going to have something running. Ideally, I'm looking for a URL after that.
That is perfectly right. So from and I think there are different things to unpack from that point, right? If you are a developer, yeah, you get the exact point from your application. You deployed your code, Shipa created all the dependencies, gave you the map, both from an object perspective as well as from a networking perspective, which is a whole different topic. But you can see which applications are connecting to protocols and so on. So the mesh for your app. It does give you the endpoint for your app or the URL. So Shipa gets basically into your cluster. So if you're using Istio or if you're using Traffic and others, basically we connect there, we create the endpoint, and we give you, again, I think one very important point that you gave is the contract between the application developer and the platform engineering team. Platform engineering team defines everything that needs to run from a corporate perspective. What type of security scans I need, what type of network policies should be applied to my apps, and so on and so forth. Now, as a developer, as I deploy my apps, I'm getting the information and I'm getting a full application workflow based on those contracts and what I'm allowed to do. And from here, I can see everything that is happening with my app. And I think one point to unpack on that is, it's very important. People fixate a lot on the getting my app deployed, but it's also important to see that there's a lot to be done after that, right? So how do you support, how do you understand what happened, and how do you go from there? Again, at the same time, you're keeping that contract. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think I kind of like this view. I guess it kind of suffers a little bit from, there's so much going on here that if I was a new developer, maybe joining a company that's using this, I would look at this and say, what does metadata mean? What does resources mean? What does units mean? How do people start to kind of wrap their heads around this? Is this something that maybe you learn and you look at as like my debugging tools? Like, how do you approach all of this information?
We approach it as on a workflow format. And I'll take a step back. As a platform engineering team, what you were doing is first you're creating what we call pools, or basically the frameworks for your application workflow. And you can create multiple pools, and these pools, you're going to be defining metrics that you need or requirements that you need at an application level, such as, again, security scan, network policies, connection into third-party services such as GCE, the managed Postgres, and so on, and making available at a pool level or a framework level. That framework can then be connected to any cluster you have. In the case I have here, I have Azure, I have GKE, I have Oracle, Kubernetes also connected. So you can connect different clusters to the different pools. The pools are going to then establish the contract between the platform engineering team and the developer. The developer, when you're starting, the only thing you need to do is, again, push your app through Shipa. And the way we try to drive, and there's always much more improvements to make, but the way we try to drive things is we try to give you a workflow and a metadata, such as the plan, so you know how much your application is consuming in terms of memory, CPU, environment variables, domains. If you keep going down the screen, you're going to see transactions, access to your app, resource consumptions. You're going to see the containers that are part of your app and where they're located. You're going to see where in the mapping, in case you're using a distributed app, where they're located. You can see lifecycle, security, network. So we try to kind of drive things on a workflow format that you as a developer, as soon as you deploy your app, you can quickly see kind of in tabs the workflow or the lifecycle of your app.
So it looks like, so if I understand this correctly, I'm in GCP, I click on GKE, I'm on the platform team. So this is maybe the people who might have a dedicated responsibility to make sure infrastructure is there, all the regions, all the zones, HA, even, security policies, network policies, emission controllers. And so if I'm at that level, am I like, hey, I'm going to put these into pools, and then I'm going to allow certain applications to be able to deploy to certain pools?
That is right. You allow, in the case, you allow development teams to deploy to certain pools. Let me pull up one file, for example, ECAS. So in this case, I'm setting, for example, the plan as that is me as a platform engineering team. And you can do that from the CLI as well as from the
YAML. You know what I mean? We just talked about some YAML. So who writing this YAML? Is this the platform team kind of, articulating the policy for those set of clusters?
That is right. That's the platform team defining the policies, and they can do that from the CLI as well as from the dashboard. So the dashboard, they don't have to write that. And you're going to see that whatever he writes here and he creates is abstracted from Kubernetes. So you're not targeting a specific API or a specific cluster that you're defining, but you're defining things such as the plan or how much memory and CPU, what type of security scan, vulnerabilities, and then which teams can use when deploying that app. So you're attaching basically the pools to different teams. And we've seen people use it in different ways, either using pools to isolate between dev, QA, and production, or using pools to isolate between different clusters and different regions. But that's where they start defining these policies and attaching to teams and to the cluster underneath it.
I noticed something interesting here. A lot of times when people go out and build, I'm going to consider Shipa a control plane on top of Kubernetes, managing a subset of things like releasing software. But I noticed one interesting thing here, and I've kind of advocated for this in the past. I'm interested to see why you went this direction. I always ask people, why don't you build a API specific for your control plane and not try to create a bunch of CRDs to reflect your control planes? If people want a CRD for doing this, if you build this first, you can always give people a Kubernetes facade if they just really want to write Kubernetes CRDs. Is that what you all were thinking here, or did this just kind of happen?
No, I think that's exactly the point. And I think one of the challenges, again, before we started building Shipa itself, we interviewed a lot of users. And one of the things we noticed is that a lot of the solutions out there, they are very focused on building, either built in-house by the teams or other external solutions. They build solutions for Kubernetes, kind of thinking about a specific cluster and a specific solution, rather than kind of abstracting that and allowing the user to think of application. Because if you do that, then you give users the freedom and kind of the experience the developers they need. And at the same time, you still give the platform engineering team kind of control. They own the stack underneath, and they can swap GKE 115 with 117. They can choose clusters and so on, but you don't affect the application development lifecycle and the delivery. So that was kind of the thought behind why we built it this way.
Got it. Okay, it makes a bit of sense to me. All right. So I think I got some clarity on what this is. So if I was to sum this up, it's like, look, you can totally write a bunch of YAML files, or you can take the kind of Shipa opinionated view. But my guess is underneath the covers, you have some kind of either you're using the default deployment controller with a bunch of, control plane stuff on top, or you've created your own maybe control loop or CRD. What's under the hood? And also the last thing I'm going to add there is, how do I not get locked into this, right? Because if I start using all these commands, if I were to peek on the back end of the Kubernetes, what objects am I going to see? Am I going to see some custom stuff? Or am I going to see some things that I could possibly, if I decided I don't like Shipa anymore, that I can actually run with? I'll love answers to those.
No, I think that's a good point. So, yeah, and that goes back to the point around why PaaS becomes really hard at scale. And when we built with Shipa, we actually connect into your existing clusters. So if you're using Istio or if you're using traffic, basically we leverage the resources for each different clusters that you have to build those resources or those objects. The objects, they live in your cluster. The ingress, it's your cluster. At any time, you can go in and change. It's a standard Kubernetes one. It's not custom things that you're going to have to learn later. So, I mean, being completely clear later, if you remove Shipa completely, your applications are still going to be running. You are back in the world of creating and managing all these objects and the relationship and so on, but you're definitely in no way locked into that. Our goal was never to lock people, but rather solve the problem and allow them to use what they need.
Let me see. I'm pretty sure you got some shiny GKE cluster somewhere. I love to see the objects underneath, because I think a lot of times what I see with some of these things that really kind of present themselves as this higher level platform, you tend to be like, oh, I don't know what those objects are. And it becomes like, I could never get away from this thing, or I can never leverage third party. I think more importantly, if I see maybe an ingress or a mission controller where I want to have some additional policies applied, can I still do that if I can't understand your data model?
Awesome point. So we have the clusters here. Magic. It's a love and hate relationship, but you have the kind of a dev GKE cluster, which is basically pointing to my GKE cluster here, GKE1. If you go inside the GKE1, or even better, let's go into the applications. We have a Gitlab app, which is an application that we have running here on Shipa right now. And it's actually performing some canary right now, release of this app. But if you go into here, you can basically see all the objects that are created, and you can customize it. You can add specific configurations that you need into that.
Oh,
and build additional.
So it looks like you're still creating objects. It looks like you got some labels in there so that your control plane can pick things up where it left off. And then go back up. I think, did I see like some sidecars in there? Are you putting some platformy sidecars in the mix? What are those extra containers or extra configs?
So what we're running as extra configs is basically to abstract some of the monitoring information for you. So for your, for your transaction information for your apps and the consumption. So those are the only sidecars that we actually implement to get the information we need there to display this. And this can later be extracted or imported into an external Prometheus. We're using Prometheus on the back end. You can throw it into an external Prometheus or Datadog or New Relic or whatever you use on board today.
I saw a nice question. So someone popped in, how is Shipa different than Red Hat OpenShift? Like, that's kind of my first question when I look at this and say, hey, isn't this like what OpenShift is doing? What's different?
Great question. So OpenShift, at least in my mind, it falls exactly into the past side, right? You have to use OpenShift clusters on IBM or on whatever clouds that you're supporting right now. It becomes very expensive from different points, right? Either from licensing costs or from you having to use a specific cluster. I hear that upgrades are really troublesome and so on and so forth. So you're kind of locked into that. The other thing is the way they operate from an application level, there's a lot of rip and replace that you have to do, such as when it comes to your CI pipeline and CD. While Shipa, we plug it into your existing CI CD pipeline. The post management of the apps, you're back on a lot of the object management perspective as well. While with Shipa, it's giving you the application context view through and through. So at least the way I put them is it's your traditional path that if you're thinking about building a scaled infrastructure and allow you to have control over everything, it may be a challenging option for you.
I guess the case is, if I understand right, can I just like connect Shipa to OpenShift since OpenShift has like Kubernetes in there? Can I just literally be like connect OpenShift and just use the Kubernetes interfaces just like I would GKE if I prefer this better?
Yeah, and we've seen users actually going down that route exactly because of that. They have some Kubernetes in-house. They started the OpenShift. They saw that they wanted more flexibility. So layering over OpenShift, Shipa on top of OpenShift is the option and the route that they're going in that case.
There's another dope question. I'm just going to be moderator. I'm just taking over as moderator. So I apologize.
Every time I'm ready to ask you guys a question, you guys cover it. So be my guest.
Well, so this one is, I always ask this question too, because I see this a lot in serverless environments as well. Mm-hmm. Once you start to get into this application-centric kind of platform view, the thing is like, this question is, what happens when you start to have multiple microservices that represent a single application, right? Like this is something I've seen people struggle with like App Engine, Cloud Run, you see it in functions as a service. If I have 5 apps that kind of are really kind of co-located together, or they need to run in some kind of context, these three apps equal this service. How do you represent that in Shipa? Do I just keep those as individual applications and we assume they go together? Or is there a way to kind of link these things together from some logical kind of service boundary?
Great question. So the way we've seen users doing it today is they've been using pools for that as well. So you create a pool for, let's say, e-commerce, right? Let's say it's an e-commerce app. So you create a pool called e-commerce, because one fact is you can have as many pools as you need in a cluster. So it's not necessarily a relationship of one-to-one. So you can have 5 pools inside one cluster. So the way most of the users today are tackling that, they create a pool called e-commerce. Within that pool, you deploy your front end, your back end, your payment services, and so on and so forth. And from here, then you can start defining the network policies based on the pool. So all applications can communicate within port 80 or port 443 and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the encapsulation at a higher level today that users are using to deploy multiple services for a specific app.
So I can have cluster pools and application pools.
That is right. Yep.
Got it. So there's this comment here. It says, so Shipa is an unopinionated pass control plane. How accurate?
We try to, that's a long word. That's a long definition. We try to stay away from the pass because I think people have been hurt by pass in the past. And again, we don't want, if pass is, I think, historically opinionated on a lot of things, right? And our goal is, like you mentioned, we're not locking the user into this. We don't want to be opinionated. We are unopinionated. So we see Shipa more as an application management framework rather than a pass that you can lay on top of your Kubernetes clusters and so on.
All right. So I think this other question, I think it came up in the survey. I'd love to get your opinions because I see a lot of people struggle, and I kind of go, it depends on how you look at this. Some people believe that Kubernetes should solve the CI/CD problem. Either A, shipping something built in, you can kind of see this in like Argo CD or Tecton, where people are actually building out, you know, in many ways, a CI/CD workflow engine inside of Kubernetes itself. And that seems like it will be on the same stage as Shipa building an app platform, you know, and then people building a CI/CD platform. But the more interesting question, though, for most people, I think that they have is, how do you deal with, like, I have all of these pools, I have all these application targets. How do you command and control all of that from your CI/CD system of choice?
That's right. And I think I kind of making a parallel or just sleeping that there. Passes, many times they also they're very opinionated when it comes to the CI/CD. You have to use specific CI/CDs. So I think that's another big difference where Shipa, we allow you to plug into your GitLab or your Circle CI and so on and so forth. And the way we do that, one example we have here, I have my GitLab CI configured. Is this okay? Can you see it?
Yep, I can see it.
One very simple way that we do is we allow you to install a Python library called Shipa CI. That Python library can then connect to the Shipa API, either through server password and email or just a token. And that Python library can do multiple things. That Python library can create a pool. It can attach a cluster to the pool. It can create the app, can deploy the app, can delete everything else. So you have full control directly from your CI pipeline in a way that if you're a developer, they don't want to use the Shipa CLI in any way, they can do it all directly from here, both your developer and your platform engineering team. And the other thing as well is, if you do this, you're gonna be removing the need of creating all these objects for your app. So it removes that from the developer. All the way that if you're delivering things such as Canary, which before you have to learn, like, oh man, how do I use Istio? How do I define this? How do I create my YAMLs from a Canary and things like that? Shipa replaces with kind of 3 flags: steps, the weight, and the interval between them. So it makes life a lot easier, and it plugs in kind of the full life cycle of the app into your pipeline in a way that pipelines have full control. And then after that, you can just come in here and see, kind of manage the post-deployment part of your application.
So it looks like you're going to block here until that Canary process either completes or fails in some way, and then someone needs to come and do some remediation. I would be remiss not to think about this. Like I think HashiCorp just announced this thing called, what is it? Waypoint, which is this idea of like, how do you tackle that last mile of that kind of CI/CD process? Everyone is comfortable with the whole build, maybe do some testing, but deployments is very different than releasing. And it seems like where they have maybe a framework, you're saying, hey, Shipa's like, this is how you do those most common things. Is that kind of the direction with that command?
It is, exactly. And I think the big thing about it to also notice is that this has to be tied to your application lifecycle, right? Because if you come in and you solve the last mile deployment, which is a big problem, there's no way I'm minimizing that in any way, but it is a part of a much bigger piece, right? If you just fix that, but you don't fix the post deployment, it's not tied to that in a way that, oh, okay, I know how my network policies are working, my monitoring. And like you mentioned, if anything went wrong, rolling back everything automatically and so on and so forth, then you get yourself and your team back at building things all over again to try and mitigate what it doesn't solve. So we tied that last deployment fix with the overall kind of application workflow and lifecycle.
Oh, so here's a question. I like these day 2 questions, right? Because, that first deployment, most people get that right. People get a little happy, but it's that 4 months from now. And I think this question kind of touches on that. 4 months from now, how's it going to work? If Shipa is kind of overseeing Kubernetes, Terraform, and CI/CD, and I guess more appropriately, it has like integration points. How does it handle things like failures, rollback, remediation, and then like the order of operations? Like, how do you define like, I need this to roll out, and then when that's done, go and do this other thing like switch DNS or something?
Yeah. No, good question. And a funny comment I heard from one of the users we were talking to is that we were talking about the whole day 2 thing, and he came up, man, I don't want to talk about day 2 because I cannot even pass day 1.5. So a lot of people are stuck even on the 1 day and a half. But the point on the kind of day 2, day 3, day 4, as going forward, Shipa keeps a life cycle of your app, right? Basically, when it was created, by who, or when the application scaled up or down, when new versions were deployed, and so on and so forth, and attaches the log to that. So it makes it very easy for you to see exactly what's happening. Now, when you're deploying and there's canary, for example, and something fails, Shipa rolls back everything automatically. And during the deployment phase, Shipa keeps the live application. It's doing all the build and deploy and all the tests on the back end. As soon as everything goes up, for example, and then there's a live application there, that's only when Shipa swaps the routing for your app, and then you get the live app, and then Shipa unboxes or undeploys the other live app. So
what I would like to see too is like in the future, because like that process of automatically rolling back, I'm pretty sure a lot of people that are in this hangout, I've been in situations where you can't necessarily roll forward because the automation is broken in some way. Maybe it's your fault. And there's always this desire to say, don't roll back. Maybe I'm in a staging environment. I want you just to sit there and let me live debug because maybe something's broken with Shipa, or maybe there's something in my app that is like literally crashing, but it's the first time we've ever seen this. So rolling back would actually lose the kind of resolution of the environment, so I can actually troubleshoot this. I guess for me, I would like to have like a pause. Like, I want you to pause, leave it in the state that it's in. I get that it's broken, and then let me go behind the scenes and maybe even resume that. Or I think maybe some questions here would be, it would be nice if there were hooks. And I think this is something that Spinnaker did pretty nice, which is just owning the fact that there's going to be parts of a pipeline that just need a manual wait, right? For someone to say, hey, if you're at this state, imagine being able to give me all the Shipa metadata at that state that I can then feed to Terraform or some other tool that needs to work on things outside of the scope of Shipa. And I think that'd be a really dope way to think about this going forward. It's like, will you fit in well into my custom workflow when the time comes?
I think that's a great point. And one of the ways we've been discussing about rolling out in the or including in the roadmap is it allows you to roll forward, as you mentioned, but it keeps a snapshot of what happened at that point in time in a separate URL access and a separate container and so on and so forth, in a way that you can still go in there, troubleshoot without affecting the app, and then roll it up again and merge once this is fixed. So I think that's a good point, and that's something that we're planning to roll out sometime soon.
Here's an easy one. How are image managed, right? So, and I've seen this in the day 1 scenario. People think that they want the container registry inside the cluster. And I think you've already mentioned this, is that Shipa is not a Kubernetes distribution. It assumes you have one already. And however that's configured, Shipa will just kind of layer on top of that. So this question is just like, well, how are the images managed? Is there a registry built into the cluster?
You don't need a registry built into the cluster. So if you don't have a registry, Shipa will just basically have that inside Shipa automatically. But reality is, and what we tell users is, you should not use that way in production at the end of the day, because then you get into a lot of tricky situations. A lot of the users, they have their JFrog, their Docker Hub, or whatever Docker registry image registry they have. And we connect Shipa to those, and we leverage those, which is a much more reliable and easier way than having you kind of manage an internal registry in your cluster. And your DevSecOps team or your security team, I'm sure they worked already around some image registries and validated some. So it makes your life even a lot easier as a platform engineer, per se.
So once I get Shipa up and running, there is a registry out of the box if I want to get moving quick.
That's right.
But just like that big problem of, you want to make sure that your images are available where all the clusters may live versus wherever Shipa is doing its command and control.
Exactly.
All right, I'm going to switch to another one. Here's a short question here. How do you debug your deployments or test resiliency of your configuration with Shipa? And I'm going to throw something in here of what I've seen people do in the Kubernetes world, which is, they try to have a real cluster, and they try to have that real cluster configured as best as possible to production. You'll never get to 100% production. And what I've seen there would be people really thinking about integration tests, really thinking, before we go and release software, let's let it bake. Even if it's just for 30 minutes until an hour, you want to have this concept of like, let's soak this together inside of this environment. How do you go about that in the Shipa world?
That's a good point. In our case, I think there are different ways you can tackle that. One is because Shipa integrates into your CI pipeline, it leverages a lot of that. And I think the other big point, that when you build an application framework, then Shipa abstracts your Kubernetes cluster. You can move an application from a GKE cluster into an Oracle cluster, or vice versa, directly from here.
Listen, don't do that.
I won't say anything. We are unopinionated. So you can move application between different clusters, different versions. And we've seen people using that to facilitate a lot of the tests, facilitate a lot of the deployment of the app in a way that you don't have to build specific objects for specific clusters, because at the end, at scale, this can become a huge nightmare. So Shipa abstracts that away for you. And when you're deploying, then you have options such as app log, and that you can see directly from here and export it to logs.io and others. But you can also see the activity that is happening directly from here as well, and see what's happening and troubleshoot directly from here. So I think there are two components. One is making sure cluster is irrelevant. You use the best cluster for you that fits your corporate strategy, but you keep your application development lifecycle outside of it, so you can move clusters and so on without impacting the app. So
ideally, I should be having this integration pool where I can do some of this kind of resilience testing, maybe some chaos engineering, and then I can take that same config and consider propagating that to another environment. Okay.
That is right. Yeah.
So here's a longer question. So Shipa's monitoring is impressive, and it seems to solve some issues we currently face. I have some questions. One, is there an alert system? Everybody wants an alert system when they see dashboards and metrics, by the way.
Yeah.
If I have an application that is experiencing increased latency, can we be notified? If so, is there a facility for multifaceted monitoring and alerting? Example, I like to know if my Cloud SQL instance has hit 90% CPU and the app depends on is seeing increased latency, PagerDuty or Slack integrations.
Yeah, good question. So we create integrations into incident management tools, and I'll highlight that you see GitLab in there. A lot of folks, they will say GitLab is not an incident management tool, and I get they are not, but they have an issues piece. So if you're using GitLab in your CI, we allow you to close the loop. But responding to the question, Shipa allows you to create alerts into your incident management tools based on app utilization, application deployments, application failures, and so on directly from here. at an application level. So some of the apps you can maybe hook it up into PagerDuty. Some of the other apps you can hook up into Vector Ops and so on, and create those alerts based on the actions that you want, utilization, failures, deployments, so on and so forth. So that is baked into Shipa today.
So if I look at this and I will give you feedback, I think this is honestly, I think this is the best that most people can ever achieve, because I've worked at a few companies that have infrastructure products, and this is always one of the asks that come up. Can you take your data and somehow alert me? And it turns out alerting is really complicated. People is like, well, you also need to integrate with my on-call schedule. It can get real crazy real fast. And so I do like this concept of like, look, for the ones that are well known, maybe create a webhook and send all the information so then people can, finish the full integration on the other side where they have maybe more tools dedicated to it. Yeah. I'd probably like to see, and you probably have it here, where you just give me a generic one. Like I have something running in serverless. I just want to give you my endpoint, and then I'll do my own custom thing. I think that's where a lot of people want it to be easy, but again, day one easy may not necessarily be easy on day 2 and day 3 when you have to do something complicated. And I hate waiting for feature requests to land in all the products that need to integrate.
I think that's a great point. And here on the web, we have kind of some custom built ones or some pre-built ones that you can hook up into this. But we've built basically into a, let me see, a webhook format in a way that you can create your custom webhooks. If there is something that you want to plug into, a different tool that it's not here on Shipa today, but you want to plug into your existing tool and get the information based on the activity of your applications, you can do that directly from here. And the other part that you have is basically Shipa plugins. So you can even create even deeper automation outside from a specific app perspective. From all the apps, you can have integrations into other existing tools. So we make Shipa again flexible for you to actually build into your workflow that fits your day 2 onwards.
So I gotta say, I was trying to hold my dope rating for something that deserves it. You know what I mean? Because like PaaS, look, there's lots of PaaSes. I've used them, even built some. This part to me, though, is the thing that I wish all platforms would do, is own the fact that you will never, ever be able to have every feature that I want. And then making things like event hooks be first class. And it sounds like you've thought about the life cycle of these events, right? So on create, on delete. And if you have any experience with like Kubernetes, mission controllers change the game in terms of Kubernetes extensibility, using things like OPA to basically do a lot of deep policy management. And then this piece around plugin install. So I have a question around this plugin. Is this plugin at the command line tool layer? It says plugin install. Is this to enhance the command line tool, or is this going to be something that happens on the control plane?
It happens at the control plane level. So it makes it easier for you to basically integrate into external tools or external scripts. And I've seen users using even to automate kind of Terraform other activities and basically plugging further into their CI and monitoring. So basically allows you to bring any type of automation that you want or extensibility of Shipa at the control plane level and integrate with any activity on Shipa in that case.
This is the A+ feature. I can definitely see people with weird workflows for reasons needing this kind of extensibility. And my hope is that the data model is clean on the plugin side and what the response is on the actual integrations, because that will help people kind of keep the typed infrastructure nature that we benefit so much from here. I'm going to go back to some of these questions, but I just want to call out this part pretty dope. I like this particular piece. So here's another question. Is Shipa's pool abstraction mapped to Kubernetes clusters, a cluster or clusters, or can one map it to micro partitions like namespaces? So I guess the question here is, like, what is a pool? Like in the VMware world, a pool might be a bunch of EXXI hosts coming together that then people pull for CPU and memory to create VMs. What is it inside of Shipa?
Good question. So right now, the way the relationship with the pool works is you can have as many pools as you want per cluster, per one cluster, but you can one pool can only sit in one cluster. One cluster can have multiple pools, but one pool can only belong to a single cluster, because we're enforcing a lot of policy, network policies, security challenges, and so on and so forth. So we keep a pool per cluster in that case. Now, to your point, pools are basically that abstraction that you're going to enforce the policies and the guardrails around it. But that's how it is laid out today, at least.
Yeah, so I was thinking pools to be like, you know, I have a lot of customers that, and even in my personal experience, sometimes I want a conceptual Kubernetes cluster, which is zone A in region A, and then zone B in region B, right? And these are geographical boundaries. I don't want my developers thinking about that. I want them to think about, look, your deploy target happens to be, you know, these two clusters, but just think of it as this one kind of multi-region pool. Is that something that you can express in Shipa, or is that something you're thinking about?
That's something that we're thinking about, kind of build a higher abstract or a higher level of the pool, right? You have the pools at a lower level at a cluster that is going to build the controls at that cluster level, but we're working towards kind of having a higher level in the sense that you can just say, deploy here, and then the load balance, it's going to load balance between the two regions in that case.
Yeah, that would be super dope. Here's another question, and this one happens a lot. So when you see all this automation based on health checks, and I think I've had this experience, like I've worked in banks and enterprises where you legitly will have planned outages, right? Like people don't really talk about that stuff, but that's the reality. So here's a question here is, how do you disable health checks and probes during the planned outage if I want to stick to maybe the Shipa way of looking at the world versus dropping down to Kubernetes?
So the health check that is happening there, it is optional at the shipa.yaml file. So if you remove that, basically Shipa will run a clean deployment. If it fails at the end, we'll just do the rollback, but it's not running a probe at the end of the day. So the probe is actually optional for you to have it there. So you can remove that. And some folks, they have been using even the pool and removing the probe to actually do some migration. I think everybody knows that Kubernetes version migration is not the easiest thing in the world. So we've seen some users actually using kind of from pool 1 to pool B, move all the apps here, disable the probe so you can kind of turn down everything. So that's one of the tactics some of the folks are using, Shipa, the pools, and probing versus not probing.
And if I was thinking about implementation details here, this would actually be a bit of a challenge, because once you create a health check, and then you serialize out to the native pod infrastructure that Kubernetes relies on. And if that health check is in place, and let's say you take down a database for maintenance and you do like when Apple launches new products, right? They go and they put we'll be back soon. So this is like a planned thing. And in that case, the pod is already deployed. And so what you want to do, and it feels like a nice feature to add, would be the ability to say, I don't want that health check to cause Kubernetes to do anything weird. Because right now, if you do that planned outage, Kubernetes will start moving things around and restarting things. And I'm not quite sure how you would do it from an implementation detail outside of maybe having your proxy or your sidecar be the front door for the health check. And then, of course, you're always going to just relay that back to the user's container. But it might be dope because then you can actually take that config flag, maybe in real time, and just have your proxy say, you know what? I'm just going to report healthy. Even though I'm lying, the user wants to disable health checks in a way that's like ignore the response for a little while until I engage it again. So maybe hopefully that's what they were getting at there.
That's a great point. And the question on that is who would be the owner in your opinion? Is that a platform engineering team that kind of has those outage plan and action points, or do you think this would be at the developer's side?
Yeah, I think it would be one of these things where it can be a joint responsibility. Like if I was a developer and I know I'm about to do like a Rails database migration and I expect something weird, but I don't want you to make the problem worse, because I've seen that before, right? Where I know I'm going to do something bad to a service, but I don't want anything to freak out because even a 500 response will fall back to cache, but Kubernetes doesn't know that, right? So maybe my health check is like, oh, I can't get to Redis. That's a problem. And of course you should probably fix the health check, but it's too late for that, right? So I think it's one of those kind of shared responsibility options where as a developer, I can say, you know what, for these 3 services, I want to, if given permission by my platform team, to disable, and maybe you got to do it like one of those light switches, right? Where after 30 minutes, if you don't re-enable it, it just goes back on so you don't go home and forget about it. I've seen people do that. So I think it's one of these kind of make sure it's visible to everyone, but make sure that you can toggle it without necessarily breaking Kubernetes.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
I know we
Makes
only
sense.
have a few minutes left, so I'm going to stop this whole moderation thing and turn it back over to the real moderator.
Give my job back. No, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Kelsey, for reading the questions. That was great. And I think we've got enough questions. We could probably go on for another hour here, but we are close to the top of the hour. So what I'd like to do to kind of wrap it up, I just want to reshare the results from our poll here and just let you guys take a look real quick. I feel like we pretty much covered all of these to a pretty good extent. Any final comments on kind of the state of the challenges around Kubernetes that you guys like to share with anyone before we wrap this up with a call to action here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big takeaway for me is that I've always wanted people to work on making Kubernetes disappear. And I think the Shipa team has that right mentality of saying there are certain workflows, and your workflow is not going to work for everyone. It's probably not going to work great for machine learning workloads. You probably want to go look at Kubeflow for that. But I think this kind of splitting the command and control, I remember this from the networking world where people would give me access to create VLANs, but I couldn't configure other switch ports. And I think when people start to think about this separation, then the learning curve can be addressed because you're not going to be creating Kubernetes objects, even though I think you should at some point understand how they work, just in case there's a problem with Shipa. I think the separation between CI/CD pipelines and the tooling that Kubernetes lacks, I don't know if Kubernetes will ever provide those CI/CD helpers natively, but having kind of this approach. And I would say the last piece here around the lack of real application management workflows at an enterprise level. This one's so challenging because even within a single enterprise, you just see so many different opinions. Either you have an existing thing that works for all the things that makes your company money, and then you have all these new ideas that you would love to leverage because things change over time. I just think you're going to end up having a lot of those. The question comes down to, how do you express those things in the pipeline that is managing these multiple ways of working? And then how hard is that last mile making for you to adopt that particular implementation of infrastructure?
That's a good point. That's a great point. And I think just to comment on what you mentioned, the way I express to folks when I'm talking to them is like, hey, listen, if you're implementing Kubernetes today, it's because you're changing what you implemented yesterday, right? So chances are that tomorrow you're going to be changing Kubernetes as well, either for something else or for a new version or whatever. So I think the key is, like you mentioned, how do you start thinking at an application level, application workflow, and having something that allows you to basically swap components underneath without impacting that. I think that's the mentality that we're trying people to change and start thinking about it rather than being aficionated at the cluster level and kind of functionality. But I think it's a journey at the end of the day.
Well, thank you guys very much. Really great conversation. Kelsey, a huge thanks to you for being here and participating.
Hey, I think it makes sense to address this last question, which I think is the home run for a lot of people. There's a question here is, how do you get started? So I think the Shipa team should take that.
That's where we're going. Yeah. Thank you, Kelsey, for the prompt. But Bruno, yeah, do you want to talk about how people can get their hands on this and start taking a look at what Shipa can do and how it might be able to help them address some of these things as well?
Yeah, so Shipa is free for you to start. You can go to learn.shipa.io, and that's where the documentation lives, as well as all the instructions on downloading, implementing Shipa. One of the things that you're going to be expecting from us is we're gonna open source a few components of Shipa over the next few weeks as well. So you're going to see more and more of us participating on the open source, and the goal is how to make this incredibly easy, right, for folks to get applications deployed. But one of the things I want to encourage, and I can't stress enough, is participate, right? Try to provide us feedback. We want to drive this and the reason why we love to do this today with Kelsey is we want to learn from you and from your experience rather than just being another opinionated tool that we're building on what we think it's nice. We want to build this with the community. So we appreciate everyone that has been providing feedback and anyone new that provides new feedback to us as well and work with us.
That's great. Thank you, Bruno. And I have to say, and I've told you this before too, this is really the thing that attracted me to join Shipa as well, is this whole community approach. I think this is the right way to do it. And in the end result, you're going to build a solution that's going to be a lot more useful to a lot of people. So given that, or having said that as well, I did put the link to learn.shipa in the chat. So if you're here with us live today, you can click on the link directly there. And then for anyone who does download and try out Shipa and provide some feedback to us, we've got something to send to you as well. For everyone else, who the questions that we read off here, we're going to be sending you guys a mug. So look for an email from us getting your details so we can send a containers and coffee or coffee and containers mug to you.
Awesome.
All right, Kelsey and Bruno, thank you so much. Thank you for helping us launch the community here. And we will get the details out to the next one, which will be before Thanksgiving. And we'll send a link out to everybody so you can join us at the next one as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kelsey. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.